So, ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon, I'd like to submit to you that race is an opportunistic fiction. It is a story that European men composed for the purpose of justifying the enslavement of African peoples. It is a novel written on the epidermis of every person, causing melanin to serve as the text we are all forced to read. Race is a socially constructed system of categorization based on superficial biological determinants for the purpose of economic classification. I was not born black. I was born human. Society looked at me and deemed my physical features as belonging to the race called black, but race is no less a fiction than Peter Pan and his lost boys. Welcome to Neverland, y'all, because race is not real. What is real is the daily lived experiences we have depending on the racial categorization that society has determined that we belong to. Racism is real. Racism is the systematic oppression of a particular people group, of a people based on their nationality or the color of their skin. Racism is more than name calling. It's more than looks of disdain. Racism is more than unwanted followers in your shadow as you shop. Racism is the lived experience of the socially deemed inferior that oftentimes ends in a death sentence. Race is the fiction that maintains racism's reality. These are not just my personal opinions. They are sociological, historical, anthropological, and theological fact. In her book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, Isabel Wilkerson further substantiates this claim, declaring, quote, color is a fact, race is a social construct, end quote. I love how Audrey Smeldy explains it. She writes, quote, we think we see race when we encounter certain physical differences among people such as skin color, eye shape, and hair texture. What we actually see are the learned social meanings, the stereotypes that have been linked to those physical features by the ideology of race and the historical legacy it has left us, end quote. This is why Jamar Tisby declares in his book, The Color of Compromise, the truth about the American church's complicity in racism, that, quote, there is no biological basis for the superiority or inferiority of any human being based on the amount of melanin in her or his skin. The development of the idea of race required the intentional actions of people in the social, political, and religious spheres to decide that skin color determined who would be enslaved and who would be free, end quote. In other words, race is a system of categorization for the purpose of establishing a social hierarchy to determine dominant and subordinate people groups. This social hierarchy is necessary in order for racism to exist and thrive. According to Ruben Rosario Rodriguez in his book, Racism and God Talk, A Latino Perspective, quote, racism is distinguished by the systemic imposition of ethnocentrism or racial prejudice by one social group upon social structures and cultural practices that not only foster racial discrimination, but also produce long-term racial disadvantage for other social groups, end quote. He continues explaining that, quote, by definition, whenever one social group exercises political power over against another group with the intention of advancing its own political advantage and cultural domination while limiting the political, economic, and cultural opportunities of the other, we have an instance of racism, end quote. So that what's critical for us to understand this afternoon is that within this definition is a much broader exploration of social hierarchy and power dynamics. This is important because there are four pillars or four ways in which racism manifests itself in the larger society. The first is internalized racism. Because we are all racialized beings, racialized bodies operating operating within a racialized society, we all internalize racism in different ways. We all internalize the way that racism speaks to how we show up in society. For example, I internalized racism even as an undergraduate student from the standpoint that I would show up to my undergraduate, my graduate, even my postgraduate courses in full suits because I had internalized the white supremacist idea that I would not be respected or viewed as a professional because I was a Black woman. So that as a Black woman, I had to show up in spaces over the top professional in order to even be seen as normal or average. The second way in which we experience racism is interpersonal. So we've got the internalized racism, but we also have this interpersonal racism. This is the racism that we typically talk about. It's the racism that speaks to the negative attitudes and actions that Black, Indigenous people of color experience, whether aggressively or passive aggressively. This is what we tend to talk about. But racism is not just our experiences with one another. It's not just the microaggressions or the burning of crosses or various hate crimes or the usage of various racial slurs and stereotypes in a negative sense. Racism is also institutional in the sense that it exists in various laws, policies, and practices, but it is also structural, meaning that there are systems at work that invoke multiple institutions and perpetuate harm and discrimination against Black, Indigenous people of color, even in the absence of racist intent. So what does that mean? In other words, I think a great example of this would be that mass incarceration is a great example of structural racism, because mass incarceration literally is the manifestation of systemic racism against Black, Indigenous people of color, but particularly Black men. And it is able to do this because of the amalgamation of a variety of institutions. So because of the criminal justice system, because of our policing practices, because of the slavery clause that remains within the 13th Amendment, because of unemployment discrimination, because of poor education in certain communities, because of poor access to health care. All of these institutions work together to perpetuate the systemic problem that is mass incarceration. So that mass incarceration is not a racist system that can be blamed on one individual person or even one individual people group. It cannot be isolated because it is the product of a variety of institutions that are at work, even when there is the absence of racist intent. This is critical for us to understand because one can be complicit in the institutional and structural manifestations of racism, thus making one a willing participant in the operation of those racist systems. Particularly given that we are all participating agents who cannot opt in or opt out of the racialized system. We are all always engaged in the system. The question is whether or not you are willing to undo the system. As Jamar Tisby writes, quote, "If racism can be made, then it can be unmade." So are you willing to participate in this unmaking? And I think what is critical for us to understand as well is that when we're talking about racialized bodies, we're not just talking about Black bodies. White bodies are raced as well, given the classifier white. Asian bodies are racialized bodies. Hispanic or Latino bodies are racialized bodies. Every body that moves in these, as Maya Angelou says, these yet to be United States, each and every body is a racialized body. So what we then need to think through, particularly when we're asking the question, can I be racist and a person of faith? It's that we must understand that not only can you as a person of faith ignore or avoid the realities of racism, but we must also understand that racism was a Christian invention. Anthea Butler, in her recent book, White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America, and Robert P. Jones, in his book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, provide historical and statistical data that prove that race and racism are white Christian inventions. The intrinsic nature of white supremacy and racism within American Christian narratives and the American Christian imagination is at the center of the larger Christian church's inability to absolve herself of this infection. So that when we ask ourselves, can we be racist and a person of faith? The truth is, yes, you can be racist and a person of faith. But furthermore, you can be a person of faith and actually invent these kinds of social and cultural systems with ill intent. The question is not whether or not you can be racist or whether or not you can avoid or ignore the realities of racism in our society, but whether or not you are willing to acknowledge the inherent brokenness and then participate in the fixing of it.